And then also we have the commentary from Shechen Rabjam Rinpoche. And like I said earlier, this study is really premised on you reading the book. Because what I do is really focus on some things that I think could tend to require some unpacking, and hence I'm not giving a summary exactly of the text. I try to sum it up, but at the same time also emphasizing things that aren't necessarily emphasized in the text, and also going lightly over things that I think are fairly straightforward. I'd like to say that today's subject matter requires that you're relaxed and feeling well, and how do you say, there's a lot of perspective in this. We're going to be talking the view, and so the well, we're actually going to be covering, you could say, we continue in the relative bodhicitta, but we're also going to be looking at absolute bodhicitta. And this, you can say, is something that sometimes leaves us baffled, because there we're actually talking to the best of our ability as much as words allow. We're looking at reality, how it actually is. And of course, what the Buddha famously did not teach was a new set of dogmas, but he did challenge some of our assumptions about what we could say is some basic aspects of our ignorance, unawareness, and also some of our belief systems. So this way, it's something that is really valuable for our practice, something that gives, you could say, the view or the perspective, the aerial perspective. Okay, I'm going to cut off the audio now. No, not audio. The webcam, and let's focus on the text itself. So the text, and once again I should remind you what we always are reminded when we reach into the, you could say, the department of cultivating the three prajnas through hearing, reflecting, and meditating, is that we undertake this with the aspiration to benefit all beings, in that we are addressing something that's relevant for everyone everywhere. We should recognize the universal relevance of what we're doing, and hence this is not just a private project of self-improvement or our own little private nirvana. This is really about enlightenment and the possibility that we could really benefit others. So the text reads then in chapter 7, the root of suffering: when undesirable things come to pass, or when you simply wish to be rid of sufferings, you must understand that these are proof that their cause, non-virtue, must be eliminated. Mustering the four powers, attack the one responsible, ego clinging. So we'd want to appreciate that suffering doesn't just come about for no rhyme or reason, and it's also not something that's given to us from some outside agent that wants to punish us or test us or whatever. We are in a position to do something, and we're going to be addressing the root of suffering, which is the kleshas. And there's going to be a particular way that we can deal with this, particularly in terms of us who are on the path with what we call the four powers. So the first thing we want to realize is that the suffering is caused. That means that we can do something about it. And since it's not random, since it doesn't come from the outside, we identify the cause of it as our clinging to our ignorant fixation on a self. Now, ignorant here doesn't mean that we're just not privy to some information. It actually literally means that we ignore. And you could say the very nature of the path is that we cease to ignore. So when we say ignorance, it's not lack of information. It's not like we're not in on the secret. It's simply that we sustain a practice of ignoring. So we're going to discontinue this practice of, you could say, putting our head in the sand and so forth. And that is then what means uprooting ignorance. The practice of ignorance is then fixating on a self. And from that then comes what we call neurotic actions that come from this belief. Now it's important, as this is one of my pet peeves, but really in a modern or Western context, it's important to understand that when we talk about giving up, fixating on a self, we're not speaking moralism. We're simply speaking about why things aren't working out. Now also, as Trungpa Rinpoche in The Path is a Goal, that we studied a few sessions back, mentions we'd want to begin with the branches before we sever the roots. So it's very difficult to go right to the what we call the co-emergent ignorance, but we can talk about the the labeling ignorance, which are then the neurotic actions, the kleshas, and also the actions that are based on these kleshas, the likes and dislikes that then bring about particular afflicted attitudes, and these then inform our actions. So what we in brief call kleshas and then karma. Now this we call non-virtuous actions, simply because it's something that is counter to our well-being. In Buddhism, it seems that we are stuck with these kind of expressions, and since you could say the practice of virtue is not really part of modernity and post-modernity and so forth, we haven't really come up with any alternative to that. So we have a somewhat archaic expression, which is virtue, but I think we can possibly handle that. And so what we're addressing with the four powers is then extracting ourselves from the grip of these non-virtues. So the four powers, they literally are, so as we're practicing, then we actually, as modern people, we very often have a particular predicament because we're not supposed to have guilt, right? So if we feel guilty because we did something obviously stupid, then at the same time we're also aware we shouldn't feel guilty. So first of all we feel guilty, and then we feel guilty about feeling guilty. And there's not really much we can do about it, except we are giving some cool phrases like just let go of it and so forth. But there's something quite real about having regret, some sense of acknowledgement that we did something, and sort of, you could say, objectifying it, having it as external to ourselves, but also being clear on that this is what brings suffering. And then we are determined to not pursue this further. Moreover, if we expose this, there's also some value in having someone that embodies the lack of such neurosis, and that could be the Buddha, that could be the teacher. In Vajrayana, preliminary foundations, we have the Buddha Vajrasattva that represents our innate purity, but this is then the second power, the support. Then there's antidote, and this is then the practice, such as a particular practice of purification, and also living that in that we are in our post, you could say, purification stage or post meditation, we then actually avoid perpetrating what was the cause of regret. And this is then on the basis of the fourth power, which is determination, to not get stuck in this or not perpetuate this particular destructive pattern. So these four powers are very real ways of dealing with that. Pray that all the degeneration and faults, which are the causes, conditions, and results of the suffering of an infinite number of beings, may ripen upon you, and that all beings may be free of their sufferings, which are but the result of their own negative actions. So again, this being caused, we're dealing with it, and we have this attitude that we also find in the Lojong, and in fact, you could say that present chapter is very much about Lojong, that we consider that the suffering that we might have as a result of negative actions, since other sentient beings are also involved in similar actions, we simply pray that whatever suffering might ripen on them might also be purified through ripening on us. And through that may all beings be free of their sufferings. So what we do when we do something like that is really that our present suffering actually attains some purpose. And it's not that things change. What is being transformed here is due to our attitude. So when we are suffering, it reminds us of cause and effect, and it reminds us that we can actually do something constructive. We can do something about the causes of such suffering. Moreover, when we suffer, it enhances our compassion, and that's where we could exchange our happiness for others' suffering. Rabjam, he says, we can make this wish. Let me make use of this suffering. Through my suffering, may the sufferings of others be alleviated. May all beings be free of suffering and enjoy happiness. So in this way, you could say there's several constructive angles when we suffer, and also when we realize that the causes of these sufferings. Especially whenever any of the 5 poisonous emotions or any of the 8 worldly concerns arise, seize hold of them with fresh presence of mind. Now this here, we have 5, then we have 8. There's nothing really that complicated. It really just means that when we know that we are, you could say, acting on the basis, or we are in the grip of, you could say, afflicted states of mind based on clinging to the self, and we all know that. We can intuit it, we can feel it. And also, similarly, when we have the 8 worldly concerns, when any of these arise, then we just recognize it. So it really just means when we're caught up in agendas that are centered around me. As far as the 8 worldly concerns they go, we have actually a way of summing them up. We could sum them up as hope and fear. Hoping for something good for us, fearing something bad for us. But specifically, we talk about them as pain and pleasure. Hoping for pain, fearing pleasure, fearing pain and hoping for pleasure, fearing gain and hope. Hoping for gain and fearing loss, hoping for fame, fearing anonymity, and hoping for praise and fearing to be blamed. So when we recognize these with a fresh presence of mind, it's really just being aware of what's going on in our mind. And Rabjam Rinpoche quotes Nyingma Rinpoche, who used to say, hold the spear of mindfulness at the door of the citadel of the mind and proclaim, if you, the enemy of obscuring emotions, intensify your presence, I will intensify my vigilance. Only when you disappear will I relax my own vigilance. So we're really just being aware of what's going on in our mind and being aware that these kleshas, they're in a classical sense, we say they're like thieves. So we want to catch them before they make off with our wealth, which is virtue. But it's something very immediate and ordinary, and it's really just in any moment of our existence to be aware of what's happening in our mind. As a mental exercise to vanquish ego clinging, recollect at all times you have been wronged. First think of all the obscuring emotions and the notion that beings and phenomena truly exist, which create obstacles to the higher aspirations of all beings in general and of Dharma practitioners in particular, and the difficulties and adversities arising from these. Then gather all of them with your inhalation, dissolve it into your own ego clinging, and destroy the curse itself. Gather into one essential point a fierce determination to eliminate ego clinging, together with its antidote, and the meditation practice that averts it. So we're really just identifying what is it that drives our ignorance and our suffering, and how this drives everyone's suffering, and also those who are practicing. And then we recognize all the difficulties that come from that. We inhale it and we dissolve it into our ego clinging. And Rabjam Rinpoche actually gives a visualization for this. He says, there's a specific practice that can be done to help overpower the feeling of self-importance, which is the cause of all of this. First, gather all the obstacles, difficulties, and adversities in with the breath. Let them hit your feelings of self-importance like cannonballs until your ego clinging crumbles like dust. Then enjoy the freedom and lightness of being liberated from the prison of ego clinging. So we recognize that the source of these 5 obscuring emotions, the 8 worldly concerns, and all of that is ego clinging. And everything we're doing is to destroy this curse of grasping at an ego. So this is no oversimplification. It's as simple as that. Of course, again, in a modern context, it's important that we're not talking about any sort of, how do you say, martyrdom or any unhealthy psychological practice of self-deprecation or low self-esteem or any of that. You could say all of that is caused, again, also from clinging to an ego. And so we practice this visualization here to eradicate the cause of such clinging to the ego. Here, the Rabjam Rinpoche says self-importance. Again, we're not talking about self-worth and all of that. We could actually, to some extent, we could equate healthy ego or self-worth and so forth with basic goodness. And so what we're addressing right now is all these neurotic habits that through our, you could say, protracted practice of ignoring is allowed to thrive. So in this way, we're simply vanquishing all of that, destroying this self-importance, the self-clinging, and then we relish this sense of being free from that there is a light space of liberation. We're not identified with that. So this is what propels the practice. Though seemingly insignificant, it is the very crux and brings the greatest progress on the path. That is the relative mind training. So if we were to sum it all up, the essence of relative bodhicitta and mind training is dissolving the clinging to the self. Rabjam Rinpoche says, you will make progress on the path. Focus on dissolving your clinging to the notion of self. This is what the essence of training in relative bodhicitta or relative mind training is all about. The implication here is that we uncover and also cultivate this heart which is imbued with loving kindness and compassion. And we don't do this just as a fleeting inspiration, but really as something that we keep with us at all times. So with the practice of giving away our own happiness and taking the suffering of others, we do this with this continual presence of the wish to alleviate others of suffering and that they might have happiness. So this is really what we continually keep in mind throughout everything we do. Of course, our spiritual practice, but then also in our post-meditation. So we should understand enlightenment here in terms of freeing others and benefiting them. Rabjam Rinpoche, he says, have the courage to vow to dedicate all your efforts to attain enlightenment in order to free countless beings from suffering. So this was what we were talking about before in terms of our motivation for any kinds of practice, but also anything that we do. And Rabjam Rinpoche also quotes Shantideva, who says, there is a measurable virtue in wanting to cure even the mildest headache of a single being. What about wanting to dispel all the suffering of all sentient beings? So what we're doing here is no trivial matter. But then again, this is what lies at the very heart of, you could say, what we intrinsically are. Naturally, we are not caught up in this ignorance, and naturally we possess this goodness which has such compassion as its natural quality. So now chapter 8. Actually, we can maybe just take a break now, if there are any questions before we start chapter 8. Hello. Okay, any questions? No? It's all straightforward? Okay, good, good. All right. Look, we'll see how we go, and we'll take questions that might be in regard to this chapter. We can take them later as well. And by the way, let me just say this is synonymous with all the practices we have, such as Lojong, training the mind, and so forth. So many of you will be familiar with this already. And it's something that's really important in terms of post-meditation. You could say meditation, to some extent we could say it has the leisure of we being isolating ourselves in some sense, at least physically and verbally, and hopefully also to some extent mentally. We have a leisurely situation when we meditate. But in post-meditation, then we continually have to deal with our projections and others, and it's a much more turbulent situation. And that's where we really benefit from something as real as the practice of meditation. Practice of compassion, loving kindness and compassion. That has so much to do with relating to the other. So that's immensely valuable. Okay, now we're going to be looking at the real stuff of our reality. And this is what we call absolute bodhicitta. You could say with relative bodhicitta, we operate with the notion of self and other. In ultimate awakened mind, training in that absolute bodhicitta, we're not we're looking at the very assumptions basic even to the projections of self and other. Now, we want to understand in terms of us practicing this, we practice these together. You could say that the compassion of relative bodhicitta, the caring for others, is something that arises naturally out of absolute bodhicitta. And likewise, also relative bodhicitta in the absolute sense is absolute bodhicitta. We'd want to, we very often say in classical terms that these two aspects are like the two wings of a bird. Both are required to fly. We should also understand that what happens that the relative and ultimate bodhicitta, they really exist as the nature, the essence, and then the character of awakened mind. But the thing is, awakened mind manifests, is not just a blank. And so when we perceive objects or we perceive something within our field, then we tend to objectify self and other. This is right down at the basis of our bias, or the first link of dependent arising, where we think self, and then on the basis of that we think other. And that's where we are then caught in duality. And we now approach this in terms of wisdom and method, or absolute and relative. The wisdom, which we're looking at now, is then what we integrate through the various methods, whatever they might be, all the various practices on the path, their methods. But what we're going to look at here is the actual wisdom, what it is that we want to realize. Now, this lack of wisdom is why beings then they suffer. They're caught in ignorance. And once they're caught in ignorance, they continually keep creating more ignorance. It's not as if there's some, you could say, deterministic vision that we're all destined to eventually become free of ignorance. It's not like that. We could go on infinitely being at war with our projections, and this creates more suffering. So right now, due to extraordinary circumstances, we have a leisure, we have all the advantages where we could actually address this. And we should do this not just for ourselves, but really caring for others. So we care for others, but then again, it's not enough just to care for them. We actually have to do something. Now, absolute bodhicitta then. And we're going to look at this, you could say, to have an overview. It says, once you grow familiar with this, develop absolute bodhicitta. So this means that we are right now beginning to familiarize ourselves with a greater vision. And this is what we are going to approach. We think of this nature as insight. And what it does is it cuts through suffering. You all know the image of Manjushri holding the sword. And this sword is directed towards ignorance. It cuts through the web of the entanglement of suffering, and particularly ignorance, or the ignorance that drives suffering. So this sword is wisdom, and we also refer to it as prajna. So we approach this, we proactively cultivate through studying, and we study what is meant by awakening, and implicitly also how did we get confused. And then we see how does it fit with myself. We reflect critically, thinking, not just learning by rote, but really analyzing, looking at this, how does this apply? And we also clarify. If there's something we don't understand, we ask questions. We approach this critically in the sense of, well, also seeing, does this make sense? But more than anything, really see how does it fit with myself? How does this actually apply in terms of my experience? And once we have this understanding, then we go on to meditate, which is then to gain experience of this awakening. So Rabjam Rinpoche says, by progressing through these three types of knowledge, we gain insight through direct experience into the absolute aspect of the awakened mind. We become more familiar with the nature of the inner phenomena of mind and the outer phenomena of appearances. So we're not learning something new, we're just opening our eyes. And so what we're doing here is looking and becoming familiar with reality. As simple and as, you could say, daunting as that. Now, as far as understanding the ignorance, that is what we are onto here, which is what we will see also is referred to as the object of refutation. It's something that we need to get rid of. We want to understand why do we want to get rid of it. It's because it drives the belief in two things really, clinging to me and the other, self and phenomena, also what we could call all the objects, the inanimate objects and so forth. The thing about this ignorance is that it then, with all its likes and dislikes and all its fussiness, turbulent neurosis, and so on, it amounts to afflicted emotions, conflicting emotions, afflictions, whatever we choose to call them, kleshas. And these kleshas then in turn drive our karma. And it's then karma that drives our rebirth in samsara. So however we understand rebirth, I would warmly recommend you to Those of you who didn't have the privilege to follow the teaching from Tsongsa Gyaltsap Rinpoche on the discussion around rebirth at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, a few days ago, soon the recording will be available on the SI website. Please have a look at that. So that explains what we mean. Rinpoche will explain there what we, Rinpoche explained what we mean with rebirth in samsara. Anyway, the Buddha didn't teach. This is something also Rinpoche makes a point of. With all of this teaching, it wasn't to make a point about how others are wrong. He was right. It wasn't to expose his profound insight, but the Buddha spoke out of compassion to free beings from suffering. And so when we also realize how unfounded this delusion is, how our ignorance is actually completely delusional, there's nothing there, and we see how unnecessary it is. We should be like Avalokiteshvara, we say, whose eyes are soft, clear, and moist from compassion for sentient beings. So the root text reads, all discernible appearances, both outer and inner phenomena, are like dreams and illusions. In the past they did not exist, in the end they will not exist, and in between they appear through a chain of interdependent factors. So what we're saying here, this is like a dream. The dream actually didn't happen. It's not going on, still not there. It's not going to exist in the future. It's just something that happened due to some imprints on our consciousness, various factors, dependent arisings. But the thing is also, as much as we say that, the truth is that we are caught by this delusion and by the projections. And we're not alone. All sentient beings does this. So we should keep this verse here in mind and really keep that thought about a dream and illusion as a simile or as a metaphor for our experience. Rabjam Rinpoche says, appearances become more transparent and less solid as we familiarize ourselves with seeing phenomena as dreams and illusions. And also I'd like to refer to Trungpa Rinpoche, who in training the mind and cultivating loving kindness, in the slogan, see everything as a dream, he says it's not about vaguing out. Seeing everything as a dream doesn't mean that we all of a sudden have a blurry vision of everything. It actually is the very opposite. The moment that we're not involved with the same degree of intense attraction or aversion, or greater, lesser degrees of it, then we actually are able to see things more vividly. So this attitude of keeping the metaphor of phenomena as dream, it actually enables us to be more vivid, more perceptive, more clear with our reality. So what we do then here is, in absolute bodhicitta, is that we understand then that phenomena exist as not reality. It just exists due to causes and conditions. We're not saying it's not there, but we're saying it's not solid. And this is where we appreciate the need to see through these conditions. But then again, we know also when we're in a dream. When we're in a dream, they appear as they do, and we actually believe that it's really happening. So the point is that we miss this. So right now, what we're trying to do is to establish some certainty around the nature of our perceptions. And once we have that, what we call the view, then this needs to be stabilized. And this is then what we do through the practice of meditation. Although they appear, from the very beginning, phenomena are empty of true existence. Intrinsically, they are without essence, nor do they remain. The expression is the kayas and wisdoms, yet the absolute nature never changes. As it was, so it shall be. So, Rabjam Rinpoche here says, appear. Sorry. So we have. Yes. Sorry. These phenomena that we're experiencing right now, we can either see them like we see them habitually, or we can begin to become a bit wiser. And this seeing them as a bit wiser is the possibility when we talk about kayas and wisdoms. When we let go of our rigid, well, let's start with saying the moment that we are very strongly clinging to the self, and we have this strong sense of self and other. We have the typical point of view of sentient beings, and this we see in terms of time and space, causation and so forth. This is what we generally all operate with, and this is what we call impure or invalid perception. So when we begin to see that phenomena are not that real, if we analyze both the self, and we're going to do this in some more detail later on, but we begin to appreciate the constructed nature of our self and also of our perceptions, we begin to let go of things, we then become a bit wiser. And what we are doing here is what we call realizing emptiness, meaning that things don't exist as solidly as they appear. And at that time, then the expression of reality is not one of me and my struggle with others. It's actually you could say, more light version, a more luminous, more vivid understanding of reality. It's not like all of a sudden the Buddha doesn't have any perceptions, but the Buddha is not caught through this realization of emptiness, knowing that things are a dream. Then we talk about reality in terms of kayas and jhanas, or kayas and wisdom. We'll get back to this, but we appreciate these two ways of seeing reality is, on one hand, the impure vision that constitutes a sentient being, those who are caught up in delusion, and as such they experience 6 realms of samsara. They experience karma that is driven by, drives the various projections and all their actions, and kleshas, that's what is behind the karma, namely the afflictive conditions of the mind. So that's on one hand. And then what we have on the other hand, what a sage, what someone who's sublime or not confused experiences, is then a valid or pure vision. And this is then why we, in Buddhism, we sometimes have these representations of Buddhas and pure realms and so forth, which embody this experience, or they symbolize, or metaphors for this experience of purity, what we then call the experience of kayas and wisdom. So the point here really is to understand that when we say realizing emptiness, we're not just talking about something blank, we're just talking about removing our, you could say, blinkers, or removing our dark shades and actually seeing clearly. Not knowing this, childish sentient beings treat phenomena as if they were solid and real. Thus begin a chain of attractions and aversions, and the great suffering of this existence, a non-existent masquerade. The Tibetan word for relative truth is actually masquerade, or concealed. So when we're, you could say, caught, gullibly, naively caught, then we have this experience of, as Rabjam just says, in our confusion, we treat the phenomenal world as real. And we don't really see the actual nature of appearances. We are fooled. And this doesn't make us bad persons or anything. Actually, in the Dzogchen teachings, in the Mahasandhi teachings, or Maha'ati teachings, we say the Buddha Samantabhadra attained liberation without doing anything good. and sentient beings wander in samsara without doing anything bad. What simply takes place is one mistake, and that is solidifying phenomena. And on the basis of this, then we have the endless cycle of samsara. And that's why we have all this suffering of existence. But we want to appreciate that this is just a non-existent display. The powerful roots, and of course, having said it's just display and so on, it's all like a dream. We are not underestimating the grip of this delusion. The root verses go on to say the powerful roots are ignorance and assuming that beings and phenomena truly exist. When these become habitual, conditioned existence arises. So we have this delusional condition, and Rabjam just says our ignorant habit. I'm going to read, this is so profound what Rabjam just says, so I don't really want to, dilute any of what he says. So there's a paragraph here I'm going to just read straight out. Our ignorant habit of misconstruing the phenomenal world as solid leads to grasping at reality, which is the root of samsara. The more we grasp, the more solid phenomena seem. This long-standing habit is difficult to change. Our grasping is like an old piece of parchment paper that has been rolled up for years. When we try to lay it flat, it immediately rolls up again. Over time, the parchment can eventually be flattened. Likewise, we need time to disentangle ourselves from grasping reality. We need to reflect and investigate the nature of self and phenomena again and again, so we can gradually come to this understanding. So, what we want to do is look at this habit, and we're going, like I said before, we're going to be looking in depth at this, but we also want to appreciate that this is something that is a very deep habit, clinging to self, clinging to the object. And so it's something that we continually come back to in terms of the path. The scroll rolls up, furls back onto itself, and we smooth it out. And so it furls back onto itself and continually. So this is the nature of the path. The thing is, we have to do it. There's nobody else that's going to do it for us. Now, in terms of us then applying these three prajnas of hearing, reflecting, and meditating, we do this through studying the scriptures and studying the instructions of the teacher. The root verses then read, following the scriptures and the Guru's pith instructions, fortunate beings who aspire to freedom must first acquaint themselves with the non-existence of beings and phenomena. So again, we're not saying that there's nothing there, but we want to establish the essential lack of solidity in all things being in flux, in that all phenomena are conditioned phenomena. And here we are then going to take a look at the object of clinging, which is the I. This is it. Our clinging, that's the our clinging to the self, imputing a self on on our experience, that is the culprit. So again, this is just how this delusion is, how it actually plays out. Clinging to the notion that a self actually exists is taking the thought of I to be an actual entity and results from a mistaken apprehension of the perishable five aggregates. So of course, when we have here a deluded idea, which is what we're going to refute. Now this is a very Buddhist expression, refute, but it really just means that we look at something and see that it doesn't hold up, it's not valid. So what we're going to do here is actually undress it. We're going to deconstruct it and see it for what it is. The point is that we'll discover that there is no real object, that we have a delusion. Hence, we sometimes say about this that we look at this object of the mistaken belief that needs to be dealt with. So we are not saying that it's not there conventionally, but we are analyzing and seeing that it's not there ultimately. So once we know that ultimately something doesn't exist, it gives us a very different perspective. So we essentially are going to look at how we take this body-mind components of our person, what we call the 5 aggregates or the 5 skandhas, and we take them to be a solid self. The thing is, if we look, these components, our body with all its numerous, countless aspects, and our mind equally countless, if we take these this aggregation and we define it in terms of 5 skandhas, form, you could say, is the body. Then we have feeling, feeling, concept, impulse, and consciousness. So these 1 bodily skandha and 4 psychological skandhas, we take this what is our private experience of our identity, this we take as a solid self. The thing is, if we look, these body-mind components or aggregations, they're not some unitary essence. They're multiple, they're variegated. What we're doing is that is wrong, is that we're superimposing a self on what is in fact aggregations. And this is where we go wrong. This is our delusion. If one examines properly the collection of these 5 aggregates, which are multiple and impermanent, like lightning, a waterfall, or a butter lamp, one sees, as when mistaking a rope for a snake, that the self is nothing but a misperception. It is non-existent, devoid of intrinsic reality. So we, in Western philosophy, famously have Heraclitus, who says, I can't step in the same river twice. These aggregations are experience of all the aggregations of our body and mind. They are just like a river, lightning, etc. So what we need to do is actually look, investigate. Because it's like when we look, it's actually not more real than if there's a rope lying on the ground and we actually, we see a rope at it's dusk and we come walking along the path and there we see this rope on the path, we think it's a snake. And that's where we don't need to remove the snake. We just need to look and see there actually is just a snake imputed on a rope. There actually is no snake. So likewise also there actually is no self. So there's not as if we need to get rid of the self. The thing is, it never existed in the first place. Now let's look at it. We first of all say, someone pushed me. Let's say somebody pushes us. and that's referring to me as our body. Then we'll sometimes say, I'm sad. Now this tells us that this is a mind. So can we find any self in this? If we look for something physical, can we then find something that's perceptible, tangible? We can't. If it's a mental experience, then we should look at it in terms of time. Does it exist in this experience? When does it exist? In the past, present, future? At the end of the day, what we are is that we can't find a self in terms of any kind of either location or any kind of time. What we have is these stream of conditions, but they don't, each and every one of them, contain any self. So we look at the Ganges River, and it's like Rabjam just says, it's not as if there's some little head that comes out of the Ganges River and says, this is me, I am the Ganges River. And so likewise also, if we examine me, we and mine, we won't find anything of any essence either. So that's the first thing we do in terms of just seeing how we impute self onto me and mine. Now let's take a big look at all of this, not just the subjective experience of I, but also the objective experience of phenomena. Clinging to the notion that phenomena truly exist is clinging to the notion of subject and object. All the objects one's apprehend, outer and inner phenomena, are illusory appearances resulting from habitual tendencies, like visual apparitions, like reflections on moon on water, and like mistaken perceptions. When unexamined, they are taken for granted. When examined, they are seen to be nothing at all. So we want to make a big distinction here when we are analyzing and when we're not. The thing is, when we look at the forest, we can't find it for the trees, as we say, and when we look at any phenomenon, we actually see that it's complex. We find that we cannot find any essence of it. You find the essence of New York City, people will think Times Square or Broadway or whatever. You go there, you will find that single tile or whatever it might be. So we don't have any single thing. We have a lot of conditions, but when we analyze, and we all agree, there is New York City, there is Jakob, there is all these various phenomena, but if we look, we won't find anything that has inherent true existence. So this is when we say no phenomena resists absolute analysis, meaning that if we go in there and we apply this analysis, we won't find anything there. So this is where we want to agree that phenomena, yes, there's definitely, there's New York, there's Paris, there's, our vehicle made up of countless different parts and engine parts, what have you. Yeah, it's all there. But if we look, then we don't actually find any absolute inherent existence. And that's where we say phenomena abide as the unity of appearance and emptiness. So becoming a bit wiser and not being attached to anything that doesn't actually possess such inherent existence, this emptiness or this understanding emptiness, it doesn't mean that there's not anything there, but it doesn't mean that there's no phenomena. It just means there's absence of essence. Phenomena are not definable entities as atoms and seconds would be. Therefore, you must conclude that subject and object cannot be said to exist. So this is where we establish that neither outer nor inner phenomena have any reality. So we simply overlook how things are in flux. And hence, then, what we need to do is gain certainty and determine that neither external objects nor the perceiving mind has any intrinsic essence or value. Even these parts that we sometimes think of in terms of being so real, actually, they don't necessarily exist ultimately. For something to be ultimately existing in terms of partless, then it would have no relationship to other objects. And that's where we appreciate how nothing actually comes down to being an ultimate partless, indivisible unit. Now, by continuously turning the wheel of investigation, you will gain confidence in the non-existence of both beings and phenomena. And a time will come when you achieve certainty that the two truths, the illusory arising of interdependent events and the emptiness that is devoid of all assumptions, are not contradictory, but in essence one. So, with the establishment of non-existence, we also appreciate the unity of emptiness and dependent arising. We appreciate that things, they appear as whatever phenomena there are. We're not denying that. And yet, they don't possess any essence. That is emptiness. But they're there, they operate, they're functional. And that's what we call dependent arising. And that also means that the more that we appreciate the lack of essence, as if they had some unchanging reality, we more understand their conditioned nature. Then we also begin to understand cause and effect. It's a bit like when we grow up and there's a lot of things that we don't really understand. The more we understand how things operate, the more we feel empowered, the more we can actually do with things. We might initially have approached, let's say, computers as being, and we thought of them as being impossible, made to drive us nuts. And then we begin to sort of understand the nuts and the bolts of how it operates, and we can actually operate them. So the more we understand how something works, that we're no longer seeing it as solid, we see the complexity, then we also appreciate how it operates. So the more that we understand emptiness, the more we gain a greater conviction in the law of cause and effect. Now, when we say here that we are continuously turning the wheel of investigation, we're not talking about some strenuous effort of, you could say, an academic exercise of analysis. This is more something that we experience in terms of life. This, you could say, understanding how phenomena are complex or how they're conditioned. It's something that's confirmed by our reality. But we should, however, train ourselves in assessing the nature of our reality in order to then gain a deeper certainty about the lack of inherent existence. Because this then begins to influence and allow this perspective to inform our reflections, our attitudes and choices. And this then also undermines the cause of suffering, which is our narrow-minded ignorance and the kleshas. And from having that, you could say, aerial perspective and not being caught, then naturally we have insight and also a wider perspective that comes with compassion. Now the Kadampa masters, and also we have it in Aryadeva, would say, even if you do not have complete understanding of emptiness, if just a genuine doubt regarding the solidity of phenomena arises in your mind, this thought has the power to turn the delusion of samsara into dust. And Rabjam, he tells a very sweet story of him visiting some studio in Burbank or Los Angeles where he saw the sets and how all the props actually appeared to be streets and houses, and you could look behind, there was nothing there. And he went in and saw how what looked as some doctors and nurses in an operating theater, in fact, were just actors. And he mentions how, since he arrived there as a visitor, so one of the actors actually came up to him, looking at him in his monk's robes, and says, "Are you real?" Anyway, he then says that since he saw that, then when he sees movies, this actually affects how he perceives the experience of watching movies. Okay, I hope you can bear with me. We might go over time just a few minutes. When all preconceptions that assert separation between manifestation and emptiness collapse, investigation comes to an end. Then what is the use of conceptual reasoning? So this is just to say that we analyze, but not as an end in itself. We analyze just to gain some certainty about how we go wrong and to no longer be caught by that, to no longer be fooled. And once we know that the rope is not a snake, then that's it. We don't hover endlessly analyzing the rope. We're content not to be caught by this delusion of snake. So this analysis helps us to penetrate this artificial construct in terms of self and other, what we call appearance and emptiness. We see the empty display of how phenomena originate and appear to operate in terms of cause and effect. But it's just display. We see it's empty. And from then on, once we have that, then there's no need for further conceptual analysis and reasoning. Now, there's a place where we could go wrong also with this analysis of reality and seeing that it doesn't possess inherent existence and seeing that there's nothing there. And this actually is something that has occurred a lot in, you could say, modern, very nihilist, you could say, vision that we have in modernities, where very often we have the idea of having seen through the hoax of traditional values and traditional institutions of truth and so on. And then we think, well, there is no truth whatsoever. And that just becomes, you could say, solidifying the absence. But we are overlooking that phenomena, life still goes on and it operates on the basis of causes and conditions. And all the causes and conditions in terms of our confusion and lack of confusion, all our, you could say, moments of confusion and lack thereof, wisdom and compassion, neurosis or whatever, all of that happens. So it's not as if there's any sort of, you could say, this vision of lack of essence doesn't necessarily kill truth. It's just we understand the relativity. But again, it's not just in modernity, it's also in, you could say, in Buddhist, particularly in the context of Buddhist practitioners and scholars, they might actually get this view of emptiness wrong. And that's where Shechen Gyaltsap says, emptiness is the antidote to all views. But if one, meaning, okay, I'll get to it. Emptiness is the antidote to all views, but if one clings to the concept of emptiness, like a purgative turned into poison, it becomes ineffective. So there's a lot of there's a lot of value in understanding emptiness. It cures us of all forms of delusion, meaning our clinging to self and other, self and phenomena, and also cures us of the various dogmatic views that we might have, absolutist views or eternalist views or nihilist views, like I was just alluding to before. So emptiness is very valuable, but we'd also want to see that conceptualizing emptiness, this is very counterproductive, and we have a lot of that in some of the sort of misunderstood slogans around Zen or Mahamudra or Mahati and so forth, where these are just, you could say, conceptual constructs. And this is actually where the medicine becomes poison. This is really where you could say that our ideas of analysis and so forth, they're exaggerating, or we're taking them too far. They become dogmas in themselves. Like two sticks that when rubbed together are consumed in the fire of their own making, the antidote itself must disappear of its own accord. So we establish emptiness and then rest free from conceptualization and reference point. And this particularly, you could say, applies in meditation. You could say in post-meditation, in our ordinary life, we practice compassion and so on. And also we look at how phenomena are lacking any essence. They appear, they function, all of that, but they're continually in flux due to causes and conditions. And then that we could say is establishing emptiness. We become more and more, you could say, clear on that. And then meditation then, that's where we rest free from conceptualization and free from reference point. So once clinging has been destroyed, or at least to some extent subdued, then we are, you could say, authorized to or encouraged to rest in the freedom from conceptual constructs. And this is then where we become more familiar with the absolute nature, free from reference point. So this, of course, is something that isn't not just we do, okay, I'm going to establish emptiness this week, and then from next week on, I'm never again going to sort of be caught up in conceptualization. This is an ongoing process, but we want to understand how they work together. So for next Thursday then, did I say July 23rd? Rubbish. I believe that's today. Sorry, mistake. Next Thursday will presumably be the 30th. Yes. So next Thursday, July 30th, read chapters 9 and 10. Okay, let's see if there's any questions. Number 16. Clinging to the notion that a self exists, taking I as an entity. Is the self same as an I? Well, we actually have what we call a mere self, which is, of course, if the Dalai Lama picks up the phone, he's not going to say, this is emptiness speaking. He's going to say, this is Tenzin Gyatso or whatever. So we all do that. But at the same time, if somebody might come out from the temple and somebody's taking his shoes, the Dalai Lama doesn't have that sort of strong sense of, oh my God, my shoes, poor me. So that's where we want to see through this delusion of self. So we see that there is a self, but it's really just a convention. And ultimately, there is no ultimate self. What is it that recognizes that the self is an illusion? That's wisdom. So you could say there is us stuck in the dream, and then somebody comes in and says, hey, this is just a dream, can't you see? And then we realize, oh, this is all just a dream. So at that point, we're no longer caught. So no longer being caught in this, you could say, the first link of the 12 links of dependent arising, not being caught in this ignorance that clings to the self. We then have the elimination of this ignorance, and that we can refer to as wisdom. So we distinguish between wisdom and ignorance. And then there is a question here. Does our awareness emerge from our body-mind aggregates, or is it independent of our mind and body? Well, first of all, we should say that body-mind aggregates, this seems to be, you could say, naturally part of our being. Otherwise, we would be completely operating with speculation. So we could say right now, what do we have? Well, we can see there's body-mind aggregate. But we would also say among these two, or rather, the mind is, this cognitive is the one that is more, you could say, the one in charge. So it's the causal, and you could say body is something that correlates. There's a famous acronym that goes SYNAC. Correlation is not a cause. And that's what applies here. Okay. So if awareness, so we don't say awareness emerges from the body-mind aggregates. Anyway, the question is, if the former, how can we have awareness after death? Well, that's exactly what we can say every moment is death, right? We move to a new neighborhood. But we seem to somehow still be here. And so we're not defined in terms of our aggregations and so forth. This again, I must refer to the the discussion in Berkeley recently. I would also say in terms of just cause and effect, if we say that it's the body-mind aggregate that gives rise, you could say, awareness. If the okay, let me just. If the later, why does it seem to be related to the body, i.e., our perceptions are our own, rather than being the perceptions of others? Well, this is really where we come back to the experience of self, where we're not all of a sudden going to have we all of a sudden float together and mix in a big cosmic soup where we're all sort of knowing each other. That, you could say, might be one way of describing, you could say, omniscience. But at the same time, without falling into becoming too speculative, we can say that presently we have a very vivid experience of being more or less caught up in our own perceptions. So we can say sometimes we are very caught up in ourselves, we don't know what's happening with others. And so what we're talking about here is really just relinquishing this clinging to the self. And so that provides a greater awareness of others. So you could say the degree to which we are caught up in the narrowness of self, we reincarnate with that, and what we are proposing to be free of the cycle of rebirth altogether is this wisdom that's not caught up in this narrow constructs of self and other. In chapter 7, regarding practice of inhaling difficulties and adversities, is exhale then employed in allowing them to hit our feelings of self-importance? Well, actually, looking at it, what Rabjam Rinpoche says is just that we gather all the obstacles, difficulties, and adversities in with the breath. So we let all that come in, and it says here, like cannonballs, until our ego crumbles like dust. And then we should just consider this great light open space. So we're really just talking about inhaling here with no particular reference to exhaling. But you could say once the inhalation is done and we're free of self, we can kind of like we can exhale with some sigh of relief. Then it's all freedom and lightness, liberation from the prison of ego clinging. So how could we say, this is the next question, so how could we say everything becomes much less personal? Well, it's like when in colloquial we say, please don't take it personally, right? What we're actually encouraging there is vipassana, that we actually appreciate the conditions in the situation without becoming self-centered. And also when we become self-centered, we kind of very often miss the picture. So you could say the objective with the vipassana is that it becomes less personal, but at the same time also everything becomes more vivid, more clear. All right, that seems to be the end of the questions. So I'd like to thank you all for your participating here. I always like to say your interest is by far what has the most merit in this endeavor. So again, this was a mistake. It's Thursday, July 30th. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing, from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be freed. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. Thank you, and see you next week. Okay. Bye bye.